for making it on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m. 9:07 a.m. We are here to present the third panel at this conference, Books in Motion. And our first, the panel's title is Aesthetics and Politics, which will bring us to, we're talking about motion, so push and pull, another dimension, which is the interplay between aesthetics and politics. So we have three speakers today, four speakers, excuse me, there are four people on this panel. And our first speaker is Dr. Alan George, whom I will introduce before, of course, he reads his first statement for today. So Alan George is a senior lecturer in Islamic art at the University of Edinburgh. He earned his PhD in Islamic art and archaeology at the University of Oxford in 2006. In 2010, he received a Philip Leverhulme Prize, a major award for early career researchers in the United Kingdom. He has published a monograph about calligraphy, The Rise of Islamic Calligraphy, published in 2010, and numerous articles on early Qur'ans and the Islamic arts of the book. He is currently preparing a monograph about the Great Mosque of Damascus and the catalog of the Al-Sabah collection of Qur'an manuscripts in Kuwait. So join me in welcoming our first speaker for today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here at such an early time on Saturday. I thought it would be me and the organizers. And I want to thank the organizers as well for bringing us all together, and it's been very well organized, so thank you for that. In the next few minutes, I'm going to try to do something very broad and a bit new as well, which is to look at the development of Arabic script, not in a particular period and dynastic context, as we tend to do, but in a much broader map, which stretched historically from the shores of the African Atlantic to China. So my talk is going to be, in the context of the conference, about script in motion. And behind the movement of styles of calligraphy, I'm going to ask briefly at the end some questions about how books and people traveled, and perhaps also start thinking about why scripts evolved so differently in different places. And of course, I'm not going to cover all of this in detail unless you want to be here until tomorrow morning. So, how did I arrive at this huge topic? Well, it's by working on the catalog that you've just mentioned. What I would call my comfort zone is early Qur'ans and early Islam, but I've suddenly had to catalog Qur'ans from China, Qur'ans from 20th century Pakistan, and by looking into the literature that speaks about this, I've discovered first that it exists and that there are people working on many of these different fields, doing very interesting things. So I would like to highlight this a bit today. And also that there are points of connections and developments, and it's perhaps time to begin to question these. So I'm going to take you through a very abbreviated sequence of this history, something that we couldn't have done in the state of scholarship as it was 5 years ago even, certainly not 10 years ago. And I'm going to run briefly through 5 major headings: early Islam, the rise of Islamic calligraphy, then the growth of the 6 pens, the classical styles as we know them, and then the Maghreb and West Africa, the Indian Ocean, and China. So let me begin, because it's a long program in a short time. So, Islamic calligraphy begins properly in the 7th century with the rise of Islam. We have 6th century inscriptions, and the Arabic script comes from Aramaic, and particularly from Nabatean, which is the Aramaic dialect of Petra in its written form. So we have a process whereby in a few centuries a very localized script that belongs to a remote periphery of the Roman Empire transforms and becomes a script that spreads all over the old world. So we have the earliest manuscript of the Quran that we call Hijazi in modern scholarship. And this is one of them from Sana'a in the Yemen, discovered in Sana'a. And for our purposes today, we just need to notice that they are still very close to individual handwriting. So calligraphy proper, the art of writing, arises at the end of the 7th century under the Umayyad dynasty, at the time that they build the Dome of the Rock, the Great Mosque of Damascus, and really start creating a visual identity for Islam. And there is a reform that happens at this stage whereby principles of geometry and proportion are placed at the heart of Arabic script. And by doing this, we're still in the 1st century of Islam, the Arab Muslims, are giving more importance to the beauty of script, and particularly script in books, in manuscript form, than any previous high culture of the Mediterranean, such as Greek, Syriac, and so on. And so we have the birth of the angular aesthetic of calligraphy called Kufic, and it's been called like that since the later Middle Ages. And here I'm showing you a classical example of the 9th century, the Quran of Amajur, probably produced in Greater Syria. And here then you can almost sense the geometricality of the layout and of the script. It's austere, but at the same time it is quite harmonious. So this Kufic tradition evolves for 2 to 3 centuries. There are about 18 Kufic styles that have been identified so far, so it's a whole world of its own. And then there's a transformation which begins in the 10th century, and you could summarize it by saying that script or calligraphy branches out into 2 main expressions. One of them is what's been called the new style, which is highly angular, as you can see here, and there is a very strong contrast as well between thin and thick strokes. Here we have a classical example of the 12th century. It's a luxury manuscript, and Alia Karami, who's spoken yesterday, is currently trying to analyze what's happening in this period in the Eastern Islamic world in her thesis. It's quite a complex situation because we don't have many dated and localized manuscripts. So we have this extremely refined angular aesthetic of the new style. Also try to imagine how difficult it would have been to write this in terms of control of hand movement. And we have at the same time the development of cursive styles of calligraphy, because people continue to write in the intervening period in cursive bookhands. We've seen some examples in the last 2 days in papyri. And in the 10th, 11th century, people start to apply geometrical codifications basically to these types of scripts to turn them into calligraphy that's worthy of the sacred text of the Quran. So for about 2 centuries, between the 10th and the 12th centuries, we have scripts that resemble the modern scripts we know, such as Thuluth, Muhaqqaq, and so on, but these 2 in particular. But they are mixed. You can't identify a manuscript which is written in Nasr, Thuluth, or let's say Muhaqqaq during this period, because these are later categories, later branches of that evolution. And this process culminates in the 13th century, probably in Iraq, with the formal codification of what we know as the 6 pens, al-aqlam al-sitta, and the figure that's associated with this in later Arabic and Persian historiography is Yaqut al-Mustasimi, probably the most revered calligrapher in these sources in the history of Islamic calligraphy. We have a problem with Yaqut, which is that we have dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of manuscripts attributed to him, and most of them are forged, or they were copied with his name out of respect, perhaps. But so we still don't know exactly what he actually did. And paradoxically, we're getting to a point where we're going to know more about West African Qur'ans than about Yaqut himself in that period. So it will need to be done at some point. So we have the 6 pens, and here you have their rendition by a modern calligrapher, Muhammad Zakaria, who's American actually, trained in the Ottoman tradition in Istanbul. And there is a question about the 6 scripts, which is that they aren't set in stone as we tend to take them. So Nasr in 7th century Iran was different from the Ottoman Nasr that you see here. And you can apply similar remarks, for example, to Mamluk Muhaqqaq, and the Mamluks were the masters of Muhaqqaq. So this is a question which isn't as obvious as it seems. But broadly speaking, we have a canon of scripts that develops in what's usually called the Central Islamic lands. There's a 7th script called Mu'annaq, which is used for 2 centuries by the Mamluks as well. And an 8th script, Nasta'lik, which develops in the 14th century, probably in Shiraz, and which becomes associated with the Persian language and later with Urdu. So, this is, in very broad outline, what happens in the core regions of the Islamic world, and by that I mean the regions where Islam begins and where historically the Islamic Empire first becomes established. The area that you see in yellow, and in different periods, the area that you see in red also becomes included in those aesthetics, and in particular India and to some extent East Africa. I'll come back to that in a minute. But so the Islamic world is obviously much broader than that. So let's first go west to the Maghreb, Islamic West, which stretches from Spain until the 13th century or the 15th for reduced areas. And also expands into West Africa at quite an early date. Now, we have a particular development in the Maghreb, which is the development of the script that you see at the top here, which is usually called today Maghrebi. In the sources it's rather called Mabsut. And it develops from documentary bookhands of the Maghreb. We have the earliest examples resembling that in the late 9th century. Now again, there's a PhD student at Oxford called Umberto Bongianino who's working at the moment on this birth of the Maghrebi script, doing very interesting things. But they develop a different aesthetic again, with a different cut of the pen to a thin point rather than a thick end of the pen. So you have much thinner and more regular strokes, and you have these defining long circular endings of letters as well, and particular letter forms. Now, this is one of the earliest Qur'ans written in this script. It's dated 1040, and it's also interesting because the text of the colophon, which you see below, is written in a form of classical Kufic, as it was practiced in the Maghreb, and classical Kufic remains quite widespread in this region in the 11th century, and probably in eastern Iran as well. I think they still know how to write it in that period. So it actually has a rather long lifespan. So the Maghrebi tradition develops, and there are different stylization. This is what you could call a classical Maghrebi manuscript of the 13th to 14th century. The script is similar, close to the one we've just seen. There are small variations. The Maghrebi tradition is also interesting because it's quite conservative. They keep features of the early Islamic period, such as writing the Quran of parchment for 2 centuries after everybody else has turned to paper. And in terms of verse markers, illumination, and vocalization, they remain also very close to early Islamic traditions. And in later periods, you have further stylizations in the Maghreb. So you have sub-styles that I don't need to go into right now. Now, Islam also spreads south of the Sahara in what we call today West Africa and the center of Western Africa as well. And there is a whole series of different scripts that develops in those regions. The best known, the best documented in our collection, possibly the most widespread, is what you see here. It's often been called Sudani, for Sudan, the Arabic name of Africa. But it's been renamed by recent scholarship by Nobili, Brigalia, and Constant Ames, Barnawi or Kanami, after cities in the north of modern Nigeria, where this script probably evolved, and it's been linked to the Bornu Empire, which existed there for some time. So it's a script which has its focal point in the region between the border of modern Nigeria in the northeast and Mali and Chad. And what's interesting about it is that the illumination, on the one hand, is probably related to African textiles. But if you look at the verse markers, we're quite close to the Maghrebi tradition, and they use a Maghrebi type of vocalization. So it's been thought for a long time that it was derived from Maghrebi, but looking at the script itself, Brigalia and Nobili have recently argued that it's actually a direct derivative of Kufic, which evolved in parallel with Maghreb. So this is an ongoing debate, but it's worth noting that we have in Mali dated 11th century Arabic inscriptions, so it is quite possible contextually that something evolved separately in those regions earlier on. As we've seen in Elizabeth's talk yesterday, these are interesting as well because they were carried in satchels and they were held between boards. They were not bound but loose leaf. And if you look here, the boards actually have a French inscription, La Meilleure de Hollande. And yes, they did it. It's a beer. It's written on the other board. I couldn't identify the brand. It's become a new area of research. But yes, much more relaxed attitudes there. So, as I said, there are different styles of calligraphy that evolved in West Africa. You have some which clearly derive from Maghrebi, and these are found in Mauritanian collections, and Constant Ames has shown this. I'm sorry, the script, the font has disappeared, so things are a bit out of the frame. Constant Ames, and here you have so clear derivatives of the Maghrebi tradition, which probably travel directly along the coast from the Maghreb. And the third style, which I'm going to show now because it's extremely intriguing for me, is this. This was written in 1911 to 12 for de Gironcourt, who was a French explorer documenting Arabic written traditions of this region. So he had local scribes copy text for him. And so, accidentally, he created an archive of scribal traditions as they existed in this broad area at the time. And this was written by, this is the script written by the Tuaregs of Kelsu, which is a town on the Niger River east of Timbuktu, a major trade center in the Middle Ages. And for someone like me, this is something extremely intriguing because it looks like a late branch or survival of the new style of the 10th to 12th centuries that would have been perpetuated for longer. We know that they wrote it in North Africa, perhaps longer than in other regions as well. So it's a bit for people looking into scripts like finding a fossil species somehow. And this has been published by Mauro Nobili. So we're able already to enlarge our map, and you can see that this Maghreb and African region is actually very large geographically, almost as large as the core area, even if you remove deserts on both sides. But you have a whole world as well in the Indian Ocean. So you have the Bihari tradition that develops in India, and it starts at least as early as the 14th century. These are the earliest dated examples that we have. It flourishes in the 15th century, but it's become clearer and clearer that it remains in existence much later. So we have at least one 19th century dated example, but we don't know in which context it continues to be produced. So again, it has angular features, strong contrast of thin and thick strokes, as well as a tendency to use triangular shape for letter heads. And we don't know at all where it comes from. This is still a question for future research. In India, people also produce more classical scripts. So this is Indian Muhakkak of the 15th century, and we know it's Indian from the Illumination. And you have a small corpus of manuscripts in those styles. And we know that major courts, especially in the Deccan in South India for the early period, import calligraphers from Iran to work for them. Under the Mughals in the 16th century, this becomes a more widespread phenomenon. And so India becomes part of the world of Iranian calligraphy from the 16th century onwards. And this allows me now to come back to East Africa, which is a kind of border area. So it's linked obviously to the Mediterranean through the Nile and the Red Sea, but also to the Indian Ocean. And this is exactly what we see in their manuscripts. So on your left, we have a Quran from Somalia, 19th century, and on your right from Harar in Ethiopia, dated 749. And you see that, again, we have quite different scripts that are written in this region. On the left, we have a derivative of Nasr, but which has been transformed in the process. It's much thicker, it's monumentalized, whereas Nasr is usually a small book hand or calligraphy hand. And on the left, we have an unnamed script, which we can't really classify, but which people tend to compare with Bihari Indian scripts because of the thickness of the strokes and the angular tendencies, although perhaps this still requires to be evaluated a bit further. And what we often see in publications here and there is comparisons in manuscripts discovered in East Africa and in Southeast Asia with features encountered in the Bihari tradition. So it's as if Bihari had had a very wide spread, or as if Bihari was a reflection of a broader stylistic group and the better known part of this group. And so here I'm showing you some examples with illumination as well that use similar patterns in going counterclockwise. Egypt, the Yemen, this is a Jewish manuscript from the 15th century Yemen, Indonesia in the early 19th century, and Ethiopia, Harar, with an undated manuscript. And here I want to thank Sana Mirza, who's doing a PhD about this at NYU on Qur'ans from Harar, which promises to be very interesting. So it seems that we have some elements of a common visual language in the Indian Ocean, but also with very important local differences. And this still requires to be investigated. It's not entirely surprising when you consider the trade networks that exist in the Indian Ocean. And you already have Muslim trading posts by the 8th century, very far down on the East African coast, as well as on the Indian Ocean in India, all the way to Guangzhou, Canton in China. So it is possible that some elements of style circulate along these networks. And we have in Southeast Asia, in the modern period, the development of further styles. And this is, you could say, well, there is a lot of variety here again, but this is very characteristic of what you find in this region. It's from Terengganu on the eastern Malay coast, 19th century. And what you usually have is different forms of naskh. The one that you see here is quite close to the forms that you have in the Central Islamic lands. Usually it's much more idiosyncratic than that and further away from the models. And these illuminations that completely cover the margin and their shape is also typical of Southeast Asia. Finally, China, which, as I've just said, had already had Muslim communities by the 8th century, and in the Mongol period, in the 13th, 14th centuries, it becomes a quite powerful community for a century, and it remains thereafter. So this is actually the least well-known of these areas. Most of what we have at the moment is from the Khalili collection catalogs published by Tim Stanley and Manish Bayani, where they have some dated examples, and they're the only dated examples we know, and the problem is that they arrived through the market, so it's easy to add colophons in order to add value when you're selling a completely new kind of trendy manuscript. So I think this area is also requiring some more work, but there is a very distinctive type of muhaqqaq which develops in China. We don't know exactly how to date it yet, but it has again an accentuated angularity. Surprisingly for China, the paper is sometimes a bit coarse, so that the pen doesn't flow very easily on the page and the strokes are a bit jagged. But within even this Chinese aesthetic, we have stylistic variation in the calligraphy. And again, we have the question of how it emerges. Is it through Central Asian trade links, through the Indian Ocean trade, and why does it take this different form? And I'm coming back to this in a second. But so, the map of Islamic calligraphy is almost as large, or is as large, as the map of the Islamic world itself, and it's also much more diverse than what we usually tend to think about. So we have in the east this huge Chinese region, where of course the Muslims are minorities, and we have the Indian Ocean, and I've added a dotted line with Southeast Asia, which is quite distinctive, and I should probably have added a second one just west of India here. And one area which will be very interesting to know more about is actually the Yemen, which is part of these Indian Ocean trading networks and seems to be stylistically related to them, but it is also related naturally to Arabia and the Mediterranean world. And one obvious but important point is that there are many areas of overlap, and that these borders are not fixed. They actually keep on moving, and it's where different areas overlap that you probably get the most innovation, new experiments happening. But one pattern which does emerge is that in our core red area we have highly codified script which vary but still tend to be relatively uniform across these areas. Whereas in the other areas there is a lot more variation and a lot more spontaneity in the way that the script is written, and you could say that there is more mastery of every fine detail in the central area. Now, part of the explanation for this has got to do with the way that scripts are defined. So the classical scripts are defined by each letter being defined in terms of thicknesses of the pen for their height and their width, and then the thickness of each part of the stroke is also defined by examples. And if you're learning one of these scripts, this is Nasr here, you're going to practice single letter shapes, starting with the single stroke of Alif for month and month, possibly even a year. And you're going to take 3 to 4 years full time to get the ijaza, let's say, in the Ottoman tradition. And then you're going to write 2 letters, groups of letters, and finally words. And we know that in the Maghreb, this isn't the way that these things were done. We have a testimony of Ibn Khaldun in the 15th century who distinguishes the 2 learning methods and says that in the Maghreb, people just look at a whole word which is done by the master, and they copy it until they know how to write and they have mastered the script. So there is less attention to every single detail of every single letter. And this is also the technique that's used in Africa. So one question is it or was it the same in India and in Southeast Asia? In Southeast Asia, this tradition is still practiced, so we may be able to get some answers. But one consequence of that is you have less refined scripts in what I will call the periphery, at the risk of being very unfashionable. But you also have much more freedom, and people in the Maghreb and in India with Bihari actually come up with wonderful, very creative things all the time. And one good example is Al-Kandusi, a Moroccan calligrapher of the 19th century, with his extraordinary monumental scripts. Another question is how did these styles travel? And I think this is a question we should begin asking more systematically, perhaps. And we have 2 obvious possibilities. They traveled with people. We have, it's quite well documented for India in the 15th and 16th century. You have a movement of Iranian calligraphers towards courts in Golconda and the court of the Mughals. But we don't really know to what extent this is happening elsewhere as well. Or we have books in motion, objects that travel. And in fact, not only books, but surprisingly, inscriptions as well, stone inscriptions. So we know, for example, that stone inscriptions from Valencia in the 13th century were taken, tombstones were taken all the way to Mali, where they were found. And we have tombstones from 11th century Southeast Asia, which are thought to be of Iranian craftsmanship. And Kamhat on the West Indian coast was also an important center for exporting marble carved objects, including inscriptions, throughout the Indian Ocean. And that's been studied by Elizabeth Lambert. So we have many questions. What is certain for now is that Arabic was the first script to have spread on such a scale before the age of European colonial expansion, and that these scripts are the image of an old world that was intrinsically connected and replete throughout its history with rich hybrid experiments. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our next speaker. Okay, I'd like to introduce to you next our second speaker for today's panel. Dr. Yuka Kadoy is an historian of Islamic art, specializing in the art history and art historiography of the East Islamic world, and that includes Iran, Central Asia, and part of East Asia. She has been a visiting professor at the LAU and currently working on a catalog project of Islamic hearthstone objects for the Al-Sabah collection in Kuwait. Her main research interest includes the artistic exchanges between the Islamic Middle East and East Asia under the Mongols and Timurids. Her first book is Islamic chinoiserie, published in 2009, and her recent book, just published in March by Brill, is Arthur Pope and a new survey of Persian art. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kadoy.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be back in Beirut to participate in this wonderful conference. And many thanks once again for the organizers of the conference for this kind invitation. Today I'm going to talk about space and composition in early Persian out of the book. So I'm focusing on image rather than text in my talk. Okay. So before we get into the main discussion of my paper, let me briefly summarize what is the Persian out of the book. So here the term Persian does not mean everything written in Persian, but to be used for the products made in the Persian land, including not only modern-day Iran, but also Central Asia, South Asia, and part of East Asia. The art of the book predominantly means book painting or book illustrations, but we conventionally call it Persian painting, although it's kind of misleading term. And our story of the Persian manuscript painting usually starts with a period around 1300, like the chronology established in the last century on the screen. This is because we don't have so many examples, surviving examples of Persian painting before 1300. This of course does not mean that there is nothing. For instance, if we look at ceramics produced before 1300 in the Persian land, so-called Minai wares with rich figural images like the example on the screen, we get quite a good understanding of pre-existing pictorial traditions in the Persian land before 1300. But many of the books, and also objects as well, were gone missing or destroyed due to the chaos caused by the Mongol invasion of Eurasia. However, the establishment of a new state in West Asia called Ilkhanate serves to reconstruct Persian culture. And in fact, we got a number of surviving examples of Persian painting after 1300. And for this reason, it is important to look at the date around 1300 in order to understand the genesis of Persian painting, as well as so-called the classical Persian painting style that was formed during the 15th and 16th centuries under the Timurids and Safavids, like the beautiful painting we saw yesterday on the screen. Now, why so many surviving examples of Persian painting we have after 1300? This is often linked with the Mongol patronage to commission the production of luxurious illustrated manuscripts, both quality and quantity. And this was also thanks to the commercial network across the Mongol Empire. The availability of material, especially paper, made it possible to produce large-sized manuscripts in West Asia and this in turn encouraged the use of space for image rather than the text only. And in fact, the use of image would have been, of course, useful for those who don't read. And we should also count on human resources. The Mongols, who themselves did not have an established picture tradition, actively employed or recruited skilled painters from all over the empire, and many of them were invited or forced to work at the workshop located at Ilkhani capital Tabriz. As people moved around, as objects moved around, the knowledge was transferred through various intermediary sources, such as books, a topic of our conference. And these books were in a book format, or codex format, but also in a scroll format, which I want to explore in my talk. In terms of subject matters, I propose 4 important genres in Persian book illustrations around 1300: science, bestiary, epic, and history. Due to the time restriction I have today, I'm going to focus on one of the history books today, a compendium of chronicles of Rashid ad-Din. Now, compendium chronicles of Rashid ad-Din, Jamia al-Tawarikh, is so-called the first world history, which was compiled and edited by Ilkhani the Vizier Rashid ad-Din, died in 1318, in response to commissions made by the Ilkhan Sultan Mahmud Kazan and Urgey. It consists of 4 volumes. Volume 1, a history of the Mongols. Volume 2, a history of the world, but in the view of the Mongols. Volume 3 is a so-called anthropological study, including genealogy. And Volume 4 is geography, which is still missing. And the production of this manuscript is considered as the production of Mongol political propaganda. Thus, it was produced, one in Arabic and another in Persian, to be able to circulate it as widely as possible across the empire. And today, I'm going to touch on 3 quite interesting groups of early 14th century copies of the Rashid ad-Din manuscript. Number 1 is a famous one, 1314 Arabic copy, divided into Edinburgh and now in London. And the second one, the Persian copy, 1317, which is in Istanbul. It's an interesting manuscript, but today I probably have no time to show examples from this manuscript. The third one is actually not the manuscript per se, but this is the group of dispersed illustrated pages without text from the early 14th century copies of the Rashid ad-Din manuscript, now mounted in a very confusing way in album format, known as the Dietz albums in the State Library of Berlin, and also known as the Saray albums in the Topkat Saray Library in Istanbul. And talking about the Edinburgh portion, this is quite famous and it has been digitized. So-called the digital book is available online. So if you look at the website, you can feel that to turn the pages, for instance. And the London portion has been studied and published as a facsimile by Sheila Blair. Now, let's move on to the first question, how to illustrate history. And as a short remark, I just want to emphasize that today I'm going to talk mainly on inter-Asian network rather than Euro-Middle Eastern connections, since the impact of the Western manuscript traditions on early Persian book painting has been explored in detail already. And also, again, just to remind that Iran is, or Central Asia, of course, part of Asia. So it will be, I think, important to emphasize the connections between Iran and Central Asia and the rest of the Asian countries. Now, here we have a sample page from the Arabic 1314 London portion. This is just a sample page. And the page here currently measures 43.5 by 30 centimeters. But original paper seed would have been around even up to 50 by 36 centimeters. So the page is defined by two margins, and the outer and inner margins. And the inner margin is used for defining the size of image. The pictorial movement of Persian book painting follows how viewers turn the page, of course, right to left. And this also follows the right to left horizontal orientation of writing in Arabic conversion. And it is interesting, I think, to remind the fact that, as mentioned yesterday, East Asian languages also traditionally follows the right-left orientation as well, but running vertically. As I said before, little is known about Persian out of the book before 1300. But it will be helpful, I think, to have a quick look at other ancient book traditions in Central Asia. For example, the Manichaean manuscript. I show you here a hypothetical illustrated Manichaean manuscript based on fragments now in the Berlin collections. The Manichaean script is derived from the elements coming from the Sogdian script, which was in turn inspired by Aramaic. The text is thus written from right to left, but the illustration is oriented sideways, as you can see on the screen. And this is a bit awkward to our contemporary eyes. The concept of this image orientation may have been derived from textiles, material which was widely used in Central Asia and East Asia as books. But this is another story to explore. Now back to the Rashid ad-Din manuscript. Most illustrations of the early 14th century copies of the manuscript are in horizontal format. Why this is mainly due to the fact that thanks to basically the large sized paper. I want to question this point further, for instance, comparing the sense of horizontality here with that found in the traditional East Asian hand scroll paintings, like the example on the bottom. Both examples got the same pictorial component, namely two persons and a naturalistic environment, but they treat space in a quite different way. In a scroll painting, the pictorial movement is essentially from right to left, but the viewers can indeed decide the focal point and can decide even to go back to the previous scene by rolling the scroll from left to right. In the manuscript illustrations, space is confined by margins, obviously, and what painters could achieve would be to squeeze pictorial subject into the limited space, thus distort much of the compositions. In the image above, for instance, the ground is awkwardly divided into several levels in order to suggest a sort of sense of depth or perspectives, while the trees are used nearly as a space fillers. To look at other pages from the 1314 Arabic copy, I'd like to show some examples from the Edinburgh version. On the left-hand side, I have an unusual stepped format, and it has two paintings, but they depict different episodes. And we see the flags depicted outside the margins, and perhaps as a reflection of the painter's attempt to indicate a sense of verticality. As for the folios 1, 3, 4 to 5 on the left-hand side, two images are set on a rag of each page, evoking somehow the scroll painting from East Asia, but they depict a different episode. Further to a folio 1, 3 to 4 to 5, it is interesting to compare them with the traditional woodblock printed book in East Asia on the right-hand side, which is in fact contemporary to the Rashid ad-Din manuscript. In the case of a woodblock printed book, the image is expanded over 2 pages. But the point here is to understand the process of making this page layout. And this has to be defined by a wood carver when carving wood, and then to be printed later, as we learned yesterday. So in other words, it is difficult to make any changes after carving and printing. On the other hand, handwritten manuscripts give more flexibility to painters who could a little bit adjust image compositions, but within the confined space. Now, I'd like to show another 14th century example of woodblock printed books, a fragment of the Uyghur book in Central Asia, because the Uyghurs are among the painters who are known to have been working in the Erhanic workshop. The example on the right-hand side evokes the previously shown Chinese or East Asian style of the book, rather than the Rashid Adin manuscript. And this is not surprising, given that the Uyghurs had even changed their writing style by this time in order to Sinicize their culture. So what happened was, the Uyghur script was like a Manichaean script based on the Sogdian script, thus originally written from right to left. But over the course of Sinicization process, the Uyghurs rotated their Sogdian-derived script 19 degrees counterclockwise so as to imitate Chinese writing style. But interesting point is without changing the orientation of their letters. Thus, the orientation of the writing in the Uyghur manuscript still goes from left to right. But the image appears to trace the Chinese style, which is, to me, running from right to left. So it is really confusing. Now, I want to move on to the next topic, which is just to ponder around the figural images and their relations with genealogy. So since genealogy is an integral part of the Compendium Chronicles, it is interesting to consider the compositional relationship between figural images and the genealogical tree in early Persian out of the book. One of the intriguing elements in the genealogical writing found in early 14th century copies of the Rashid Ali manuscript, such as the one on screen, is to form a genealogical chart with a square-shaped illustrations. Although the actual images are missing, we are fortunate to have some examples of square-shaped images survived in the Berlenti's albums. In this album, we have 6 of this kind, but I have found in total 11, now pasted on different album pages. Assuming that the square images were originally part of the genealogical chart, let's try to insert some of the paintings into the Istanbul manuscript and see how they look like. For instance, like this, or another combination. So what we can see here is that there is actually no obvious intention of the painters to individualize each image, and it is difficult to call them a so-called portrait. And clearly these small images merely functions as generic representations of the Mongol couples, and they are mere visual supplement to the genealogical tree. Finally, let's look at another compositional peculiarity found in early Persian out of the book, which is to visualize enthronement in the double opening pages. The Berlenti's albums contain 6 illustrations of this kind, and although we could consider them as 6 individual pages, it does make sense to see them as sets of 2 opening pages. One is with the ruler and his consort, and another with a group of Mongol attendants. We can tentatively make 3 pairs out of the 6 pages on the screen. For example, like this pairing. Now this page layout, the couple on the right and the attendants on the left, is what I thought it would be the most sensible solution. I prefer to locate the enthroned couple on the right-hand side. And by doing this, all the visual attention is given to the enthroned couple, and the Mongols are looking towards them. If the couple is on the left-hand side, as you can see like this perhaps does not work out as 2 opening pages, since 2 groups of the Mongols look at totally different directions. Although the sense of individualism is also lacking in this enthronement scene, there is a certain attention to the position of the man depicted to sit on the left and the woman sit on the right-hand side. And this is in fact one of the established customs in Mongol society on formal occasions, and the idea is also reflected in the Mongol mural painting in China on the right-hand side. So this position is not just accidentally made, but on purpose. And this suggests that the painters in charge of the enthronement image were greatly familiar with the culture of East Eurasia. In order to maximize the importance of the enthroned couple in the whole pictorial compositions, a great number of the Mongols are present, depicted as a group and lined up in equal distance. This peculiar compositional concept needs further explanations, wondering about its similarity with the Buddhist way to formalize the position of a principal deity and the rest of the attendants, like the example on the right-hand side. And here I don't say that the ultimate impact of the Buddhist text on the pictorial compositions of the enthronement scene above in the Rashid Ali manuscript, but their compositional similarities are quite striking. My final observation is to look at the roots of book circulation across Asia from the 14th century up to the 16th century, from Iran to India. The enthronement image that had been canonized by the painters of the early 14th century copies of the Rashid Ali manuscript became a model and was extensively used by the painters of the later copies of the manuscript. And this is demonstrated clearly, for instance, by a 15th century Herat copy, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and a 16th century Mughal copy, now in the Raza Library, Rampur in India. The Rampur manuscript is a perfect example for tracing the path of travels of early 14th century copies of the Rashid Ali manuscript from Iran, Central Asia to South Asia, while the Paris manuscript extended the further travel of such Oriental manuscripts up to Europe. In conclusion, the examples from the early Persian art of the book demonstrate the richness of book culture in pre-modern times in Asia. And also the examples I have shown today illuminate the early phase of the compositional development in the Persian painting. Although I have focused on inter-Asian connections in my talk today, tracing the roots from East Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, back to Central Asia, and finally to South Asia, there should be more roots of the circulation of the book culture across Asia. And I hope my short presentation today illustrates the dynamics of the knowledge transfer and the role of the books in the transmission of ideas across a wide area of Asia. And thank you very much.
I'd like to invite our third speaker for today, Dr. James Hara, whom I shall introduce. He's of course my colleague in the English department. Dr. Harab is an assistant professor in the Department of English at the American University of Beirut. His research has appeared in Ariel, a review of international English literature, English in Africa, African Studies Review, and the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, among other publications. His primary research fields are African literature, post-colonial studies, and world literature. He also teaches and publishes on graphic novels, world cinema, global pedagogy, gender, and Caribbean literature. He is currently a faculty fellow at the American University of Beirut's Mellon Foundation funded Center for Arts and Humanities. Join me in welcoming Dr. James Hara. He's taking us to another period and part of the world.
Yeah,
the 20th century.
I'm glad you did that. I have my own disclaimer as well.
Oh, okay.
So while I am one of the organizers of this conference, I feel that I must also thank my fellow organizers Sonia and Hala, for inviting me to help them realize their vision and to publicly acknowledge the pleasure it was putting this together. It was not as tedious as one imagines putting a conference together. And also I'd really like to thank the Orient Institute Beirut for hosting us today, particularly Stefan later. And also in particular, I don't know if he's here, Torsten, for organizing a host of logistical issues, making sure that everyone was here and happy. So yes, I have an admission, kind of as Serene pointed out, that I'm not a historian of books or any other kind, and I don't work on the Middle East. I'm a literary scholar, and I don't mean that as much to place myself on the margins, often just being an Africanist is enough to do that, but to let you know that I am concerned about the contents of books, their stories, and the way of telling and making meaning. I am interested in book history for what it can do for that agenda. So during the second half of the 20th century, the Heinemann African Writer Series, or the AWS, was the foremost means of circulating Anglophone African literature inside Africa and around the world, and is almost certainly one of the most responsible parties for the creation of African literature as a discipline. Beginning in 1962, the series dominated the publishing of African literature and published over 270 titles. It circulated millions of copies of Anglophone African books, including a few in translation, around the world, having around 30 titles that shipped over 100,000, dwarfing the efforts of other series such as Longman, Penguin, Crown, Oxford, Fontana, and others. I don't want to overemphasize the impact of Heinemann as a singular source for publishing African literature, because there were many other institutions through which African literature developed during this period, but the AWS does represent a unique situation in which for at least a decade or two, most of the major authors and works of the continent went through the AWS. Ultimately, this talk is part of a larger project to track how the circulation of African texts moved from AWS authors such as Ngugi, reluctantly Shoinka, and Achebe, and their ideologies in the mid-20th century to authors such as Chimamanda Adichie and Teju Cole. Teju Cole also happens to be in Beirut right now, so if you see someone walking around who looks like Teju Cole, it is Teju Cole. And I think he may be staying at the Jeffro, where many of you are staying.
He's arriving today.
He arrived.
He arrived already?
He arrived last night, actually.
Oh, I see.
So,
Okay.
yeah. So if you're going to be around for a while, he will be doing some events with him at AUB. The most troubling element of the AWS for scholars has been that it was essentially a UK company defining the possibilities for African literature in Africa and beyond. The AWS tackled this issue by establishing regional centers in East, West, and Southern Africa, run by local literary experts such as Achebe in West Africa, who had the ultimate word on what was published in their regions. There are many anecdotes to speak to this, but perhaps one of the most interesting and most telling, because of the names involved, involves Ngugi wa Thiong'o. In 1962, Achebe had just published Things Fall Apart as the first book in the African Writer Series. It had originally been published in the UK, and had done respectably, but rocketed to fame when published in the AWS. At the famous 1962 Makerere Writers' Conference in Uganda, Achebe was a figure of adoration, and Ngugi, his junior and unknown at that point, tracked him down, hunted him down, it seems, to his hotel room and gave him the manuscript for his first novel, Weep Not Child. Achebe said, reluctantly, that he would consider it, but by the time the conference finished 3 days later, Achebe had read the novel and was chasing down Ngugi. He promised him inclusion in the AWS, had him sign a provisional contract on the spot, and the book was released in the series as number 7 in 1964. Other similar stories confirm that essentially if Achebe endorsed a work, it held sway so much in the series, even with the publishers in London, that it was pretty much a guaranteed inclusion. Most of the sales of the AWS took place in Africa, at times nearly 90%. And thus it was African literature written for African readers, demonstrating that Africans writing for Africans was not another post-independence intellectual ideal doomed to never materialize, but an attainable reality. Crucially though, the AWS was a paperback series only, which kept the retail price down, making them affordable to African students. So, while the somewhat trite idea that the foundational series was simply a European or English imposition, this is sometimes argued, because it was mitigated by a Western publisher trying to make a profit is clearly ill-conceived, the notion that Heinemann, and especially Achebe, created a very particular type of literature for the series that became the standard for a continent for decades is an important line of inquiry. We must ask then, how are these texts made culturally available for non-local readers, African or others? Or to borrow from Damrosch, what are the conditions by which the AWS's text trajectories are made African and global? Achebe's explicit didacticism, as expressed in The Novelist as Teacher, in which he argues for African novels as, quote, opportunities for education, unquote, as an element of African literature not needed for Europe because European cultures had not been denigrated for centuries by colonialism. He argues that they did not need Ngugi's decolonizing of the mind to combat, quote, our acceptance of racial inferiority and the disaster of colonialism brought upon the African psyche in the period of subjugation to alien races, unquote. Achebe's didacticism, then, is not a continuation of the ethnographic traditions of Europeans to lay bare the workings of African societies for European epistemologies, or a pandering of African literature to European tastes, but an African self-referential didacticism aimed at letting Africa know itself outside of colonialism. By reviewing the series, but in particular the cover designs, we can bear this out in part. Let's just take a look at a few more. The AWS was a numbered series. The numbering, along with the inclusion of the full list in those books, served to contextualize individual books as part of a larger educational program. So in some of these, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, there's the Heinemann African Writers Series symbol, and at times, depending on which version, a number. One was reading a book in an ordered series and joining a fraternity of other readers carrying the iconic, mostly orange paperbacks. This was particularly evident on the covers of the books. Nearly all of the books had a photo of the author on the back, with a description of the culture from which he or she came from and a brief synopsis of the book, the former often informing the latter rather transparently. They were also color-coded. Orange, an admitted theft from Penguin, was for fiction, blue for nonfiction, and green for drama and poetry. This didactic turn of the contents as signified on the covers led both readers in African countries, but even overseas readers, also to think of the AWS as not only entertaining, but culturally informative. Both the Canadian University Service overseas, something akin to the American Peace Corps, and the U.S. State Department recommended the books in the series to their employees traveling and living in Africa. More explicitly, many of the texts contain glossaries for non-English words and introductory essays explaining the cultures explored in the text, the most well-known being an essay on Igbo culture and history in the AWS version of Things Fall Apart. And the first version of that book also contained illustrations inside the book as well. Heinemann, as a multinational corporation from a former colonial power monopolizing circulation of African literature in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, is not without its ideological snags, and at the time was not without its detractors. Most prominently, Wole Soyinka termed the series a, quote, ghetto for African literature. And in literary circles in Africa, the series was sometimes viewed as what Gareth Griffiths calls, quote, a general imperialistic infrastructure for controlling African possibilities, unquote. Ironically, Soyinka despite his criticism, took advantage of Heinemann's ability to publish widely and compensate their authors when his wife, unbeknownst to him, sold the rights to his novel, The Interpreters, while he was in prison. She claimed that while Shoyinka was in prison receiving 3 meals a day, his family was outside starving. I don't think Nigerian prisons are that posh, but excuse me, I take her point. And The Interpreters, which essentially was released in the UK, and after 6 weeks, about 80% of the books had been returned to the original publisher, has now been in constant print for over 30 years, and of course, Shoyinka has won the Nobel Prize. Despite a healthy skepticism in dealing with Western multinationals, writers discovered through hard experience that they were able to reach other Africans, the world at large, and sometimes even their own compatriots by publishing with the AWS. And as groundbreaking as its publication was, Things Fall Apart itself did not create an audience for African literature upon its initial publication. In fact, the book was reportedly difficult to find in Nigeria, while virtually impossible to get in other parts of Africa before the AWS. This is to say that Heinemann did not only swoop in and overpower African publishers in an already established market, but that they created local, national, regional, and global markets for African literature where few existed. It is not difficult to imagine that Things Fall Apart would have faded into obscurity like the earlier very significant and important works by authors such as Thomas Mufolo, Peter Abrams, and Sol Portage, had the AWS not come into being when it did. Beyond publishing more titles and circulating millions more African books than any other entity inside and outside of Africa for 30 years during the establishment of the field, the AWS launched an African-styled novelistic discourse grounded primarily in realism. This realism shunned the modernism of Western literature at the time, and for better or worse, realism even today is the style most closely associated with African literature. The experimentalism, sometimes referred to as magical realism of Tutola, Okri, and Cheney Coker, serve as exceptions that prove the rule, and none of these authors were published in the AWS. Why this style became the calling card of Heinemann in African literature is manifold, but given Achebe's power over the series and his philosophy of African writing, realism as a tool for teaching is an obvious choice. Heinemann's AWS on the whole did not sell its millions of books to the general reading public in Africa, but to students required by various educational policies to adopt African literature into their syllabi. As Clive Barnett states, the AWS, quote, was understood to bear a representative function in relation to African societies, speaking of them, but also speaking for them, unquote. Not unlike the questions that Frederick Jameson raises in regards to post-colonial protagonists as stand-ins for their peoples, the AWS burdened itself with the task of representing Africa to itself and the world. The dilemma of a Western publisher in charge of producing African literature becomes trickier when it purports to speak for Africa, and this speaking is in a manner accessible to secondary school audiences. Beyond the foundational questions of subaltern groups' abilities to speak, to represent themselves in fiction, particularly in English, we face the question confronting most non-Western literatures and world literature. Are these texts authorized by traditional Western centers of power to reinforce the centrality of the West? Gareth Griffiths is the only scholar to address this question, or to be, shall we say, overtly critical, by writing, quote, "We might see Achebe's simplicity of style, his simple vocabulary, his clear-cut narrative lines, produced as much by the demands of the publishing goals than by the force of traditional, quote-unquote, simple, authentic African stylistic features," unquote. Griffiths does rightly call into question the motives of a foreign publisher from a former colonial power profiting off of the work of the formerly colonized, and the way that relationship implicitly shapes content and style. We don't know to what degree modernism and other styles were shunned in favor of realism in AWS, but clearly speaking for Africa is complicated by this relationship. There are many issues with Bifrist's analysis, as he doesn't account for the audience of the AWS being overwhelmingly African. But more importantly, I suggest that as an African publisher wishing to circulate texts throughout the continent, and that an African publisher wishing to circulate texts throughout the continents would have faced a similar situation. Heinemann shipped millions of copies, and there's no reason to believe that an African publisher could have somehow achieved these numbers without the educational market. That is, given that the educational market was the only way to ensure a sustained African readership, it seems unlikely that in the decades immediately following independence, that styles that did not directly engage African realities would have been adopted by national African curriculum boards. Even if one is inclined to take the difficultly defended position that hundreds of titles in the AWS are dumbed down or watered down, despite the presence of incredibly difficult texts such as Bessie Head's A Question of Power, and the faultiness of the assumption that realism is just simple, there's little evidence to suggest that an African publisher would not have also had to yield to the economic realities that dictated the AWS be aimed at educational markets. Indeed, many of the circumventions of local censors were only possible precisely because Heinemann was not based in an African nation. Therefore, while one must admit that the AWS must have been influenced by its dependence on the educational market, and that for Africa to represent itself in a series of books would be far less problematic if a direct line could be drawn from African writer to African publisher to African reader, the existence of Anglophone African literature may depend on it not having happened that way. It is of course debatable whether the series could simply have rejected or restrained the realism of most of its catalog in favor of more modernist styles. The rejection of many of the trappings of modernism was political because a new African literature cannot be seen to simply duplicate the fashionable Western style of modernism. However, in eschewing modernism for realism, another Western style, the series maintained a focus on the ethnographic. The AWS prided itself on the notion that these were texts that taught one about the place from which they came. One could learn about a real place and culture, but also enjoy a narrative, and the covers explicitly reinforce this. As previously mentioned, content was paired with packaging that stressed these ethnographic qualities, and the various foreign entities mentioned above that adopted the series not only for its literary value, but for its ability to inform foreigners on specific African cultures, attests to the ethnographic efficacy of the AWS for readers outside of Africa. What was didactic for an African student audience played as ethnographic for foreigners and perpetuated an affiliation between African literature and ethnography that began centuries earlier. The AWS obviously resisted the specific misinformed and often racist ethnographic information of those earlier texts in favor of work that represented Africans as equal, but one knew that when reading an AWS title published in the era of post-independence disillusionment, for example, that the work would attempt to communicate what was happening in Africa. In her essay, Literature for the Planet, Weichi Dimmock provocatively formulates the tension between the local and the global in the movement of literature. Like Damrosch, Dimmock is interested in the trajectory or circulation, as geographic production location hardly defines a text because it can land or impact any number of places. She uses the example of reading Dante in the Soviet Union, specifically of a Gulag prisoner reading Dante. She argues that we need to stop assuming a one-to-one correspondence between geographic origins and a book's evolving literary radius. Literature outmaneuvers the nation in terms of scope, so much so that it presses us to think of larger scopes of reading. This inability to contain literature, the inability of Tolstoy's works to remain meaningful only in Russia or Shakespeare's only in England, demands a larger understanding of the way texts move in the world. She uses Einstein to discuss these large movements as demonstrating literature's elasticity, which is the term physics uses to explain the way matter moves in the universe. Dimmock elegantly explains how the movement of literature creates elasticity in literary time and space, a la Einstein's relativity. Texts bend, expand, and reshape themselves for different contexts, so that Dante's descent into hell can be as salient to a 20th century Soviet Gulag prisoner as to a 14th century Italian aristocrat. While embracing the way literature can expand via musings on Einstein, Dimmock overlooks the particular ways that traditionally underrepresented literatures move differently than works like Dante. The Divine Comedy can be elastic because, as a canonical text, its ties to a well-understood time, place, culture, and literature will not be unmoored by its trying journey to 20th century Russia. By contrast, Echebe, at the start of the African Writers series, believes that even Africans need to be taught about Africa. In Dimmock's terms, African literature is in danger of being too elastic and too rigid. For works such as Ama Ata Aidu's Our Sister Killjoy, unlike Dante's Divine Comedy, we cannot assume that the micro level of the text's Akan culture is situated adequately enough that it can sustain Dimmock's elasticity. To be blunt, if seminal works like Things Fall Apart and Our Sister Killjoy are read without due attention to their cultural specifics, as they often are, they will not travel well or bend once geographically dislocated around the globe and temporally displaced by 700 years, like Dante. They will be bent out of shape, rather, such as when Aidu is discussed in terms of reverse racism, or they will be broken and unmoored from their cultural context, such as when Things Fall Apart is cut off from its Igbo site of production. The AWS's rigidity in using the covers and paratextual materials to relate cultural information, as well as the realist style of most of its texts, is as pragmatic as it is ideological. We can turn briefly to the example of Things Fall Apart as holding a tenuous place despite its prominence, and how its covers in particularly illustrate the above. Here are two covers of Things Fall Apart. The one on your left is the original AWS 1962 cover of Things Fall Apart, and the one on your right is from the 70s, 1974. The now mythic events that there are two mythic events that nearly scuttled the publishing of Things Fall Apart. Achebe sent his handwritten manuscript to a typist in London from Nigeria, and they stopped responding to his letters. Only when he was able to phone a friend, a white Englishman, who went to the typist and angrily demanded it, did he get his manuscript back. And Achebe has said on many occasions that he had vowed never to write again while the manuscript was missing. And remember that Things Fall Apart, in its original form, also contained much of the material, not only for what became Things Fall Apart, but also for Arrow of God and No Longer at Ease. It was originally conceived of as 3 books in one. Secondly, in 1958, Heinemann did not even have anyone they felt qualified to internally review Things Fall Apart for possible publication. The publishers eventually gave the manuscript to an economics professor who had recently traveled to Africa for a 2-week holiday. His review famously consisted of 7 words. He turned out to be okay. His review famously consisted of 7 words, quote, "the best first novel since the war," unquote. Even publishing Things Fall Apart, an almost universally praised novel and the flagship for African literature, required good fortune, coincidence, and happenstance to get published. And we can look briefly at Things Fall Apart's covers to see this didacticism. On the left, its original AWS cover, demonstrating a variety of masks used in the narrative and an indigenous plant. Note how, this will make sense in a minute, note how this is not an acacia tree. Just hold on to that. And on the right, from the 70s, is a man, most likely Okonkwo, the main character of Things Fall Apart, railing against an image of the cross, the theme of the imposition of Christianity on Igbo land being a major point in the novel, if you're familiar with it. Disregarding the back covers and paratextual information with more explicit cultural explanations, we can see that even the covers contain images that explicitly relate to the text, but also to a politics of representation. The cover on the left acts as a response to colonial claims of a lack of civilization, thus the need for a civilizing mission, while the image on the right clearly bemoans the presence of Christianity, even in a more fervent manner. This is to say that they are rigid expressions that do not wander far from the core didactic project. I want to end with a stark contrast in approaching covers to convey the deliberate ideological maneuvers of the AWS and show what happens without such interventions. So this is, remember that acacia tree. The close linking of cover images, back cover author descriptions and cultural information, and even occasionally illustrations inside, contrasts immediately to this image of a collection of African books that gained great popularity in the US. You may see a tree in nearly every cover. This is a couple of times in these covers, and the tree in the covers is the acacia tree that I was mentioning. Most acacia trees in the world, so these are texts from Nigeria, from East Africa, Southern Africa. Most acacia trees in the world are located in Australia. Now there are acacias in Africa, South Africa in particular, but the Nigerian novels in particular are striking as the tree does not typically grow there. And while I do not wish to make too strong a statement regarding the cause of this phenomenon that casts too far wide a net, creating book covers to adhere to a Lion King version of Africa, there is a disconnect, an almost anti-didactic quality to these covers. They imbue misinformation as much as the AWS imbues responsible representation and didacticism, even if in doing so it relied on a rigid and systematic use of its covers, paratextual materials, and realist forms to awaken its audience in the wake of the nightmarish fantasies of colonialism. Thank you.
Our fourth speaker for this morning's panel is none other than Dr. Sonia Nesher Atassi. She is, of course, one of the major organizers of this conference. She's an associate professor and also the chairperson of the Department of English at the American University of Beirut. Her research is in comparative literature and also modern Arabic literature, book culture and art, and collection studies. It in particular explores interrelations of word and image and questions about aesthetics and politics, cultural memory, as well as history. She's a member of the editorial board of the book series Literatures in Context, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, published by Rachel Falar. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
Thank you very much, Celine. I would also like to thank my co-organizers, and I would like to point out that this was really a very pleasant experience that led not to dispute but to increase friendship. So thank you. And I also thank the OIB directors and the researchers for housing us and helping us out so much today. All right, so the title is Contemporary Book Art in Iraq, Unfolding Narratives of Survival and Intimate Encounters between East and West. I'm not going to read through these quotes. You can read them on their own. I just want to highlight a few key words. These are zones of privacy, intimate encounters, unwitnessed communication, freedom, and privacy. The beginnings of book art are usually associated with a specific European context, namely the illustrated book, the livre d'artiste, which emerged as a publishing enterprise initiated by art dealers such as Ambroise Vollard and Daniel Henry Kahnweiler in fin de siècle France as a reaction to the mass-produced book. The definition of book art has aroused much scrutiny, first with the historical avant-garde of the early 20th century, then in the 1960s and 70s, when new forms of book art started to proliferate worldwide in the context of socio-political activism and reproducible media such as print, and especially the poster became a privileged site of a new self-identified third world aesthetics. Books have always had a political character, constituting one of the oldest forms of documenting history, and at the same time providing zones of privacy, making possible intimate encounters and a reading practice, silent reading, that Alberto Manuel describes as unwitnessed communication between the book and the reader. Book art has come a long way from the traditional livre d'artiste. It today includes inexpensive multiples as well as valuable one-of-a-kind objects. Highly intermediate in character, it defies clear-cut definitions. Instead, it goes well with an understanding of art in which all arts are composite arts, both text and image. All media are mixed media, as W.J.T. Mitchell says in Picture Theory. What makes book art stand out then is not its media, but its emphasis on objectness. Book art transforms the condition of the book. It complicates the relation between word and image, content and form. What was considered secondary turns into the primary object. No longer subordinated to privileged text, it reverses the ideological underpinnings of word and image and stands at the center of attention. Not much has been written about contemporary book art in the Arab world. It is usually placed in the context of al-Hurufiyya, a movement that is identified by the use of Arabic letters and Arabic huruf in modern art. But book art differs significantly from al-Hurufiyya, challenging the very condition of bookness. It foregrounds its objectness, which at times little or no significance accorded to the written word. Like a number of other leading museums, the British Museum has expanded its collection of modern and contemporary art from the Middle East. Its collection focuses on works on paper, which include book art. Its exhibition, Word into Art, Artists of the Modern Middle East, curated by Venetia Porter, included valuable examples. Another notable publication is the catalogue, Dafatir, Contemporary Iraqi Book Art, an exhibition curated by Nada Shaboud that traveled to different venues in the US in 2006-2007. L'Art du Livre Arabe, edited by Marie-Geneviève Guestin and Annie Bernay-Nouri, also includes some examples of contemporary book art. Iraq has found its way into Johanna Drucker's The Century of Artist books. However, not with Iraqi artists. As insightful as Drucker's book is, it remains Eurocentric in scope and vision. Iraq comes in as subject matter only, namely with Brett Freeman's Sim War, a printed multiple. Sim War juxtaposes images of video war games and the 1991 Gulf War, as they were regularly broadcasted on CNN with an autobiographical narrative dating back to the 1960s, when the artist stayed as a teenager in a military hospital that was treating American soldiers wounded in Vietnam. In an exhibition catalogue by Wu Hang and Peggy Wang, entitled Shu, Reinventing Books in Contemporary Chinese Art, and yesterday we had learned more about the Shu, I also came across a Chinese artist, Wai Gongping, whose black-covered book, Desert Storm, remains highly relevant today as war is waged in ever new forms and foot soldiers are replaced by drones. What would a history of artist books look like that also included contemporary book art from the Arab world or China, and possibly other regions? Iraq has a rich tradition of the book, from the beginnings of writing to the height of Abbasid manuscript culture in modern times, in which Cairo writes, Beirut publishes, and Baghdad reads, as a popular saying goes. Celebrated as the cradle of civilization, the first material documents of writing in the form of clay tablets come out of Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh has come to exemplify the worldly character of texts, as its circulation history out of Mesopotamia and into the heart of the British Empire, the British Museum, and Western anthologies of world literature shows. So here in particular the anthologies edited by Damrosch. In their introduction to writing and materiality in China, Lydia Liu and Judith Zeitlin point to, I quote, the production and circulation of writing as a dynamic process, something that can be collected and exchanged, bought and sold, bestowed as a gift, or entered in the contest, something that can be cut up, pieced together, and recycled, borrowed, copied, or appropriated, something that can be stolen, ruined, lost, and destroyed. And here the words in italics are my emphasis. The same can be said about books, and in the Arab world, especially in Iraq and now in Syria, we have seen a lot of the latter in recent years. Books stolen, ruined, lost, and destroyed. What does it mean to work in book art in such a context? In this paper, I focus on contemporary book art in Iraq and one artist in particular, Rafa Anasiri, whose artistic trajectory speaks of routes of travel and circulation often forgotten or overshadowed by notions of world literature or global art that define the entry of books and artwork into the world by their arrival in Western markets. So just some background information on Rafa Nasiri, and I thank my colleague David Risley, who taught me to do maps. So I know this is a very basic one, but I was happy to be able to do it. So Rafa Nasiri was born in Tikrit in 1940. He started his artistic trajectory in Baghdad, studying painting with some of the founding fathers of modern art in Iraq, such as Jawad Salim and Shaka Hassan al-Said at the Institute of Fine Arts. Whereas most of his fellow students continued their studies in Europe, he, in 1959, went to study printmaking at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing, China. This move was made possible by the new geopolitical context after the Bandung Conference, which promoted Afro-Asian economic and cultural relations to resist colonial and neo-colonial domination, and after the 1958 revolution in Iraq, which ended the British-backed monarchy and led to the formation of the Republic of Iraq. In Beijing, Nasiri studied with Li Hua and Hang Yuyi, through whom he was introduced to different print techniques, in particular woodcut print, as rendered prominent in Europe by expressionist artists such as Käthe Kollwitz. So here it's not so much about books that travel, but about the techniques, the tools that go into their making that travel. Nasiri pursued his studies in printmaking later at the Gravura in Lisbon, and also gained experience in printmaking at Stanley William Hayter's Atelier 17, known later as Atelier Contrepoint in Paris. He returned to Baghdad to open the graphic arts department at the Institute of Fine Arts in 1974 and his own studio. After the Gulf War of 1991, he left for Amman, continuing his life and work in exile. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2013. When I did this map, I was quite intrigued. When I put down the exhibitions, so these are the orange dots, to notice that the only exhibitions he held in the US were after 91 and after 2003. So it seems that you need a war to get your artwork shown abroad in the US. Nasiri wrote about his journey to China in this book, which was published posthumously. And here the book cover comes in form of a Chinese notebook, which Nasiri also used for some of his book art, as we will see later. Before, I would like to show you some of the woodcuts he did as a student in China. And you see here that these woodcuts are placed in a Chinese context, right? So you see the houses, and you see Chinese people, man and woman on the bench, and the old man. He later then applied the same technique to an Iraqi context. So here you have a portrait of his mother and an Iraqi woman. Back in Baghdad, Nasiri founded, together with other artists of the 60s generation, among them the Azawi and Ismail Fatah, the New Vision Group, Ru'ya Al-Jadida, in 1969. The Hazima, the Arab defeat of the June War of 1967, fresh in their minds, the group foregrounded notions of rebellion, revolution, and change. What distinguished it from previous groups, such as the Baghdad Group for Modern Art, Jamaat Baghdad bil Fan al-Hadith, was the use of new media and techniques such as print. Nasiri is mainly known for his paintings and printmaking, but he has also worked in book art, drawing on different traditions of book culture, from ancient Mesopotamia to the Arabic Islamic world, China, and Europe, while taking part in contemporary artistic practices worldwide. Book art in the Arab world can build on a long and very elaborate tradition in Arabic Islamic culture, and we've seen many examples already. This has to do not only with the outstanding position of the Quran, but also with the high esteem of education, be it religious or profane, and thus of books. The Arabic Islamic heritage is a source of inspiration for many contemporary artists, but to speak of modern or contemporary Islamic art is misleading. It would overemphasize the link to the past. Rather, the question arises, what is it in the present that makes artists in the Arab world choose to open a dialogue with the past? As I argue, it is not only the quest for authenticity through reconnecting with past traditions that has been of much importance in the region's modern art history, as the manifestos of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art and other groups attest. It is also the political urgency in which book art is produced. The Arabic term used for book art often is daftar. So we heard about the 9th century daftar already in our first keynote by Beatrice Grundler. So daftar translates into note or sketchbooks. And some of Nasiri's books are in fact difficult to distinguish from notebooks, sketchbooks, close in character to visual diaries, documenting here the Gulf War of 1991. And I'll just go through some of the pages of this book and note here he is using a Chinese notebook that he got from China for these, for his book art. So it's interesting here. You have the visuals, but then you have the text as well, and sometimes the text comes across as very poetic. So it's a very private, diary-like notebook, right? But next to visual diaries, sketchbooks, Nasiri also produced limited editions and unique one-of-a-kind objects. So this really speaks to the plurality of the book formats, also in Arabic Islamic book culture, pointed out by Stefan Leder. As his country deteriorated in war, occupation, and sectarian violence, his interest in Arabic literature increased. Inspired by Arabic poetry, especially after the Iraq War of 2003, Nasiri has produced a number of limited editions on classical Arabic literature, from the Abbasid poet al-Mutanabbi to the Andalusian poet Ibn Zaydun and al-Hariri's famous maqamat as transmitted by the 13th century Baghdadi calligrapher and miniature painter al-Wasiti, as well as on modern Arabic literature, namely the Iraqi poet Muhammad Mahdi al-Jawahiri, the great Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, the Arab-American writer Etel Adnan, and May Muzaffar, his wife, who is a poet and art critic. And he himself says, I quote, "Over the past 7 years, and specifically after my homeland Iraq was occupied in 2003, I started searching for new visual resources to enable me to express my psychological state and the extreme pain and agony of witnessing the torture of the people of my country, wishing and hoping for liberation and salvation from the deterioration and disappearance of their country, once the cradle of the world's most elegant civilizations many centuries ago. In response, I sought shelter with poetry." And here I'll just show you now some of the one-of-a-kind books he did. So this again comes in the form of a Chinese notebook, which unfolds accordion-like, and then I think gets as long, the open book, as long as 4 meters. Is this correct? And here we see also how he makes use of the Arabic letter, and he says that it's not an element added to the composition, nor something of ornamental value, but instead a linear element coming out of the body of the composition. Nasiri, like other artists of his generation, embraced the Arabic Islamic tradition of miniature painting as exemplified in Al-Wasiti. And this book I'm showing you here consists of 4 wooden panels and opened is almost 1 meter long. Here you see it open. Nasiri says, I quote, I have worked continuously to generate the work of art from an understanding of the other, from testing different materials in order to present appropriate influences. But I always have had an affection towards paper and water, perhaps because I'm a graphic artist first and foremost, or maybe because my artistic heritage is of paper and watercolor, as in the works of Al-Wasiti and other original Arab painters. He has done a number of portfolios. This is one he did on a poem that his wife May Muzaffar wrote entitled That Distant Land. He has also done a really wonderful book on Mahmoud Darwish to describe an almond blossom in homage to the poet after the poet's death. And in all these books we see a recurrence of themes of exile and loss. I would like to have a closer look at a library set on fire, a portfolio that consists of Etel Adnan's text in English and Arabic translation and 6, here it says etchings, I'm sorry, that's wrong, 6 silkscreen prints, and that is on display in our book exhibition at AUB. Etel Adnan is a well-known Arab-American writer, but also a book artist herself. The portfolio was produced in collaboration with Adnan after the destruction of Al-Mutanabi Street, which was the hub of Baghdad's cultural life, known for its printing presses and bookshops. So on March 5, 2007, a car bomb killed more than 30 people in the street and burned many of the presses and bookshops. And it was after that event that Nasiri and Adnan worked together on this book. As pointed out earlier, books can be stolen, ruined, lost, and destroyed. In Nasiri's silkscreen prints, Adnan's text is scored in colors and hues of red and yellow, blackness annihilating a word, then a sentence. At the same time, the book shows beauty as an artistic practice, highlighting the materiality, fragility, and vulnerability of one of humanity's oldest and possibly greatest inventions, writing, and by extension, the book. Book art in Iraq gained momentum not with Nasiri's generation, but with the so-called 90s generation, when a shadow culture, Sakafat Azil, was able to emerge in the margin, despite the Ba'ath regime's ongoing attempt to control cultural production and the country's international isolation during the years of UNSC-imposed sanctions and continuous US and British military strikes. Hannah Malala deliberately, so she's of the 90s generation, born 1958, deliberately destroyed her 2007 book, Conference of the Birds, a handmade bound volume issued in a box. It incorporates fragments from the 13th century Sufi poet Farid ad-Din Attar's allegorical story of a group of birds searching for their king, God, whom in the end they see as their very own reflections. As Malala explains, incising and burning paper surfaces allowed her not only to facilitate the possibility of multiple interpretations of a single surface, but also to recall scenes of ravaged manuscripts in Baghdad which took place during the war in Iraq in 2003 and subsequent occupation. The result is a beautiful but highly fragile book that gives its reader an idea about the preciousness of manuscripts and at the same time documents the destruction of Iraq's cultural heritage. Likewise, Himat Muhammad Ali draws inspiration from Iraq's past, namely the tradition of manuscripts, as in the 2008 Al-Mutanabbi Street, Baghdad, which consists of 12 handmade books issued in a box. Himat makes use of images cut from magazines and newspapers, as well as ravaged manuscripts and books, painted over, tinted and covered with black and red spots to document the destruction. In Nazar Yahya's 2003 Baghdad Day of Destruction, Yom Dama Baghdad, all that remains of Baghdad, as well as of the book, is blackness, dust, and shards of glass and pottery stored in a box. I would like to conclude that in offering counter-narratives to the dominant Western coverage of the Iraq War that tells of destruction and loss, yet hold on to something to remain, even if dust and shards of glass only, traces of life and cultural production, contemporary book art in Iraq speaks of the political urgency out of which it is produced. Yahya's Baghdad Day of Destruction, Himat's Al-Mutanabbi Street, Malala's Conference of the Birds, like Nasiri's A Library Set on Fire, powerfully show that the destruction of Baghdad is not a political and human tragedy in the Arab world only, that Western media present to its audiences as life spectacle. Calling attention to the materiality of the book, these artworks complicate the relation of word and image, content and form, what is inside the box and what lies outside of it, the text and the world, bringing to mind Derrida's famous saying that there is no outside text, il n'y a pas de hors texte. Holding on to the format of the book, these artworks express what Liu describes as cultural anxiety about the death of writing, and by extension, books and civilization. As these books suggest, the destruction of Baghdad is the death of the book, the end of civilization, and can only be countered by and through the production of books. Maybe this is a raison d'être of contemporary book art in Iraq, as it makes possible unfolding narratives of survival and intimate encounters, opening up to zones of privacy, liberty and freedom, and possibilities of agency and political change in utopian gesture between, or rather beyond, East and West. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one question. I don't want to monopolize, of course, the time. I have one question for the first speaker.
Do you want to sit? Maybe shall we sit up here?
Yeah, so the speakers could maybe come up and then I'm more familiar with my colleagues' speakers. That's why I have questions for only the first two speakers, and then the floor open to questions from the audience. I noticed that there was a recurrence of colors, of three colors in particular, as you went through your slides, and they were mostly, from what I could tell, orange, not orange, what do I say, orange, red and yellow and blue. I didn't see any green. And you also said that the further away one moves from the codified center, the greater experimentation one finds in the script. Does this experimentation also extend to color usage and ornamentation, or only to the script as such?
Thank you. I think the use of color has a lot to do with the pigments you have available in your region and how wealthy you are. And so, so in simple manuscripts, you'll often have just two colors. Red is very common, and your black ink. In the early Islamic period, you do get a lot of green. It's used for vocalization, and blue. And so I think it's got a lot to do with what you can source locally. In India, there's a very rich color palette because they have more pigments available, for instance. And so remind me of the second.
If this greater experimentation, the further one extends into the periphery, also extends to the usage of colors and ornamentation.
So in this sense, yes, just because some regions have more color, but in Africa you have a quite limited color palette, for example. And again, I think it's a matter of possibilities.
Okay. So there's no correlation between color and script, moving angular versus cursive. It's
not particularly.
there's two independent factors, so to speak.
Yes.
I see.
Thank you.
My question for you is, you said it's sort of the reverse question. You said that you're going to talk about image and not text, because obviously, you only have 20 minutes. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the texts themselves. Whose pictures whose images you described very eloquently. Because obviously, again, is there a correlation between what is being said and what is being illustrated? I would think there has to be. So could you just elaborate a little bit more on the text itself, so that we understand why these images, sit side by side, the text itself, or the texts rather.
This is actually,
I don't know. It doesn't seem to be working. I think.
1 minute.
Yeah.
okay. That's a very important question. Normally, yes, of course, text is different to the image comes after, but there's a very intense study, particularly the case of the Shahnameh, how so-called break line, immediately before the image refers to the subject of the image. So there's even statistics how this last verses are describing image or not. So sometimes there are some exceptions that the last this verse is not necessarily referring to the exact subject of the image. So we have to really work on this, complexity. Connection, text and image. But this really requires a lot of work. And particularly the Shahnameh, they're working on years. They want to have really statistics, the percentage or how many percentage, the surviving Shahnameh text really, systematically, defining the text and image. But some cases are not. So it's of course, normally yes, of course, text is referring to the subject image, but not necessarily.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll open the floor to questions. Yes, Beatrice.
I have a question for Sonia and for Ella. Sonia, I'm a bit surprised when Rafa Nasri goes back to a post quite old with Nebi, which is, he goes a millennium back in time. And I'd be interested in knowing what words he takes from and what does he choose. And is that a unique phenomenon, or are there also other very, very old works of poetry that are used in these modern books?
Yeah.
And I have another question, but you want to respond first?
If you want, go ahead first with the other question.
And Ala, thank you very much. Incredibly interesting. 3 questions. I thought François Desroches had abolished Kufi, and I'm wondering whether YouTube is that. On cursive is usually meant for connected letters, so Arabic writing is cursive. I wouldn't call Kufi cursive, but if you do, I would like to know why. And then another thing is, it's a wish list. Nobody has really defined scripts very for everybody in a way that you can nachvollziehen, let's say, and you presented that very clearly. It's a problem. Some terms are very fuzzy. Do you have any idea what one could do about it? I'm thinking of Beirut, for instance, defining very clearly per alphabet a number of key letters, so that if one sees those key letters, one can say, oh, this is a Bassett script E. That would be one way. One other thing would be more descriptive, to make a corpus of extant manuscripts and put them together into a database. We have none of these things that exist in Greek paleography, for instance, and it's sorely needed because we're all swimming in fuzziness.
Yeah, so thank you for your question. with Ibn, when he refers to Ibn Zaydun, I felt he was really working with a text, and that was a love story of and how to overcome loss. With Al-Mutanabbi, or in general, I felt often this reference to the Arabic heritage is, it's kind of the big also names, which I feel is giving a wrong, if you want, a misrepresentation also. This is kind of an imagined Arabic heritage, right? Where we have the great examples only, right? So the Maqamat is, we have Al-Wasiti's illustrations, but it's not so much, I think, really in the book I showed you a focus on a particular text, but rather a quote to this heritage as such, and kind of the big examples from that heritage only, right? Because we know there's so much more also out there. And then certainly the interest here, what he says about the Arabic letter, right? Integrating that as an abstract element in his artwork.
So he's quoting Mutanabbi without text.
There is text. I have yet to look closer actually at the text, but there is text, but the text is it's fragmentary. It's fragmentary. So, and I need to look closer at the fragments.
So my turn. Yes, why do I use Kufic? It's for a very simple reason. It's that Desroches proposes to use Abbasid, and a lot of the Abbasid scripts are Umayyad. And so we have three styles which we clearly know existed in the Umayyad period, but two of them clearly continue into the Abbasid period as well. So I just use the accepted term for that reason, and because it's been used since at least the 13th century, so it's just for convenience, because I don't find the new label works better.
Desroches claims that there is no pre-modern use of it, that it was an Orientalist invention, but you say that.
No, it is. I mean, the earliest I found was, I forget his name now, Khat Ahl al-Kufiyin. It's a 13th century source. Yeah, I mean, I
Thank
will
you,
remember.
that is very helpful to know.
So cursive, yes, again, terms in that sense. I mean, Sheila Blair uses round scripts. Obviously I don't use cursive for Kufic, but I use cursive for scripts that have accentuated cursive tendencies. And I'm not a very strong proponent of that term. So if we can find a better one for these scripts in particular in the documents and then in the 10th to 12th centuries, I will use it. I mean, I don't find that round scripts, again, works much better because they're not all that round. And yes, I think Desroches' method is excellent actually, and I use it whenever I can. But you can only use it in cases where you have a series of manuscripts with very closely defined features. And you can't apply it to just one, or you could just. One thing is that people don't look at scripts actually when they do manuscript catalogs. Very often people look at the illumination and just forget the script. But so you can apply it as such to some periods and not to others. But I think we should use this kind of approach more.
I agree.
Just to continue, a database of Quranic manuscripts is in the making. In Berlin, the Corpus Coranicum project. So this task has already been started to be undertaken. What I wanted to ask Alain is, since Stefan Leder yesterday reminded us of the close connection between writing and oral tradition, have you ever thought of taking into consideration not only the markers of a fasila, of an end on a verse, but also the reading? These Qurans are not identical in text. As far as I know, Africa reads according to Abu Amr, and it would be interesting to know what other readers are involved. This is not very difficult. I think you can find it easily, but it would be part of it. The text is not the text. It's not identical with the text.
So,
and and also, I don't know, do you pay attention to such Masoretic things like Waqf and Ibtida, like keeping the text open by mentioning variant readings on the margin and so on. When the text page, unfortunately, there is no monograph about it like that we have about the Bible, which is very useful by Wirtwein or Tov, two authors that compiled anthologies of the text page through its development during the ages. And what is striking in comparison with the Quran is that very often you have on the margin a very interesting indication that text is still open. It should not be taken for granted. There are other possibilities to read, and of course to identify the reader would be a desire. This is a desire of mine. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I fully agree with you, and of course Corpus Coranicum is part of the answer to that, and so a bit of shameless advertising then. So I have done some articles about focalization in early Qurans, where I look at this and try to identify some of the readings. And in the Kuwait catalog, which is about 120 manuscripts, I'm trying to identify in each manuscript the reading as well. So I think I fully agree that it's a text, and we should look at it as a text as well. With the help of someone in Kuwait, I'm trying to do that.
Great, thank you.
Yes. I don't think it's working.
I think
Just
it's
speak
the
up.
In all the other room, you don't hear if you don't use a microphone.
We can hear you. It's small room.
Yeah.
Test.
Actually, it is like transmitting the voice to the second room, and so it actually makes sense to use it, even though within this room we don't need it. There are
I
people
don't
on the
think
other.
there's.
Thank you very much. I have a question for James. What can we say about gender representation or a women's agency when we look at these pictures or covers of these books?
Well, we can say that early on in the series, it's quite common knowledge that women were poorly represented. I mean, just as authors and in their works in general, they were pretty much absent. And I think the series as a whole is not a great place to look for for African literature by women. Yeah, and so I think the covers do kind of play into that, but again, it's very kind of straightforward and didactic. So when there are works like Ifuru by Flora Nwapa, the cover it's a book by a woman. The cover is of a woman walking, and that's it. And then like Joys of Motherhood by Buchi Macheta. I think I showed the back cover, but the front cover is a woman carrying a child. So I mean, there were authors that came to prominence that the series kind of felt obligated to include. But it's certainly that kind of didactic project that I was talking about did not really extend. And I mean, of course, Achebe is notorious for this. And he's never had, in his, 7 novels, he never had one major female character. In his last novel, Anthill Savannahs, there were sort of, but not really. And so this seemed, I think this has been an issue for the series and for Achebe himself.
Yes,
Yeah.
in the back, yeah.
I'll just.
Open the mic.
Try again.
Thank you. Thank you all for a really interesting panel. So now
Open.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you all for this really wonderful panel. I have 2 questions, one for Sonia and one for Yuka. Yuka, I'm familiar with, I believe it's in the Edinburgh Jama Heroic, the painting of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. That's often been compared to Armenian depictions of the birth of Jesus. And so I'm familiar with that relationship of artists using a different sort of iconography for representing a scene for the first time. How do they represent it? So I thought it was interesting when you bring up the horizontal sort of format and landscaping from sort of the other side of Asia. So I was wondering if you could talk more about the possible art movement of artists responsible for the paintings in the book, and whether maybe the Armenian artists were familiar with these scroll paintings, or what kind of relationship that would be. Because it was very interesting to hear you talk more about these things in depth. And then my question for Sonia, I thought my ears perked up when you said that these works should be called modern Islamic art. Because I think it's very interesting the way in which these artists are engaging with the past, and especially famous works of Islamic art, especially from Abbasid Baghdad, before the Mongol sack of Baghdad and the sacking of the Great Library of Baghdad, which is depicted in the Maqamat, which Rafa Nasiri copies and remediates into his contemporary book arts. So I think for both Rafa Nasiri and Hana Malala, despite, especially with Hana Malala's destroyed productive pages, despite that fragmentary, very temporal state, the past is still being preserved in the present in a new way. So I was wondering if you talk a bit more about the ways you're thinking about this relationship with the historic past coming and being remediated or copied to ensure survival, as we heard yesterday during the keynote. The ways that these book arts are engaging with objects and historical images of the past.
Okay, my answer is quite short. There's a list of the slaves in Rashid al-Din's work. And here we see, for instance, the Uyghurs, as I mentioned, or also Georgians, and also some other names. But we don't know exactly who were responsible for what kind of paintings.
Right.
But obviously, for the Christian themes, no doubt that someone knew Christian iconography, otherwise it's impossible. But examples I show today is actually about the Shakyamuni, that is the Buddhism. So it's clearly that someone knew the Buddhist iconography. So for this reason, I thought probably someone like the Uyghurs, who should be familiar with Buddhist iconography, might have been involved in the execution of that kind of paintings. But this is just based on speculations, unfortunately, for any medieval art studies, because we don't have the signature, for instance.
Or the list of artists.
No, yeah, so I mean, signatures appeared from the 15th century Persian paintings, but not for the 14th century.
Yeah, well, I think the relationship to the past has been overstressed, and it was important, I think, especially for the 60th generation of which Rafa Nasiri is part, right? but he was part of this new vision group that really focused on, if you want, the here and now, whereas the Baghdad Group for Modern Art, which was founded in '51, had a much stronger emphasis on the ties to the past and the ties to Baghdad before the 13th century, so the kind of golden, era. And so I think it really is more of a quote only than a continuation, especially I don't think that it's in a continuation in, techniques, in artistic practices.
Right, of course.
And artists like Rafael Nasiri are very, very keen, to have their artwork be part of contemporary art practices. Yes. This said, certainly the local specificity is very important, and it's also in light of this destruction, right? What does it mean to work in book art? At the time that he's working in it in the 90s, and then after the 2003 war, it is also a way to highlight, to rescue, if you want, this lost grandeur, right, and this lost civilization, right. So in face to all this destruction, then giving a quote back, right, to that past when civilizations seem to be less in danger, right. So that's one thing, and I think with Nasser it's also very important. I'm still trying to figure it out, but there's so many, different influences that I really think it is, beyond what we say East and West, right? So you have the Chinese influences, of which I still have to, I'm just starting to learn about, right? So to understand, already you have the format of the, you have the actual, the material, the Chinese notebook, which unfolds accordion-like, which he makes use of. In some of his notebooks also there's Chinese writing. I mean, he studied Chinese in order to be able, to graduate, to study in Beijing. So you also have Chinese script sometimes. And the Arabic script, often it is like very fragmentary, like single letters only. Yeah, so I think we have to be careful to not overemphasize this link to the past. It's certainly kind of in opposition to the present destruction, right? Holding on, to it, but I think, it's more a quote than a continuation.
Yes, please. Lydia? Well, by the way, it's 11:25.
Yeah, sorry, maybe we can
the next panel is starting in 5 minutes, so
we're
should we take maybe one more?
Yeah, let's just collect. I think there were 2 questions.
Lydia, who else?
And
had their hands up?
and then we have a
And
break
then Helen?
for at least 15
Okay,
minutes.
Lydia and Helen, and then we'll bring it to a close. Yeah, because it's 11:25.
And maybe just to add to that,
Just one thing.
Yeah.
Thank you for this extremely rich panel. I thought I would probably have a question for each of you, but then I really learned a lot. Maybe quickly, just one word for Alan. Have you reached out to scholars in China and see where the research, the scholarship is in that area? So I'd be curious and see, because occasionally you would hear news about, discovery of new Quran manuscripts here and there in the Northwest. So that, just curiosity for Yuka, I learned a lot from your, especially comparative treatment of the page layout, and then because you had such a vast amount of materials to discuss, you just probably ran out of time to really give us sort of pictures to what kind of argument are you comparing them? So is it a causality? What kind of historical linkage are we looking at? So I'm also curious about
call that, the Chinese illustrations like print and so what their actual content. But mainly my question is about the possible linkage between Sonia's paper and James' paper, because there is a different path that you're highlighting for us. You mentioned Bandung, right? And then there's the Asian African Solidarity, Writers Solidarity Association. And the first meeting was at the Tashkent. It was inspired by the Bandung conference. And in fact, Tina, Things Fall Apart, Achebe's novel, was translated in 1963 in the Chinese journal called World Literature. And the first edition, I wonder when you show the pictures there, at the cover, you didn't show the first edition, which was published in 1958. And then the cover you showed, there was a later edition which reduces that, so the earlier cover. I wonder if you have analyzed that. In fact, if you were to link his trajectory to some of the artists that Sonia brought up, and they probably, and also Darwish, and they belong to this Asian African Writers Association way before post-colonial Anglophone, that kind of discourse came into being, right? So we're looking at a very different kind of political situation in the Cold War, where certain alliances were formed, and writers and artists. For instance, Rafa Narisi's educational background, he studied with Li Hua, who was also Xu Bing's teacher. They were in the same department, except that Xu Bing didn't get there until the end of the 70s. So Nasri didn't meet Xu Bing, the younger generation. And so they came from the socialist aesthetic, the same aesthetic, right? Came from the same, so there are connections there. Extremely interesting connections, and African Asian students were sent to Beijing to study there. So we're looking at this Cold War, this other like African Asian legacy, extremely rich legacy that has been more or less forgotten, and how they translated each other's works, right? And it was not part of this like post-Cold War English departments, post-colonial literature. So I have my problems with Anglophone, Francophone literature, because this is clearly a more recent invention. Before that, it was Afro-Asian Writers Association. And they had a journal called The Lotus. And they had the prizes, a lot of these Darwish, all of these, they won prizes first from there before they were recognized by the West. And this was because of the Bandung legacy. So I wonder if can draw connections. They were clearly linked.
Well, she said it much better than I could. I think I'm throwing out a question to everyone, actually, and I thank the panel. It was extraordinary, and I learned so much. But again, I wanted to have Jin and Sonia kind of think about two things. One is the nostalgia of the image, the misrepresentation, the misunderstanding from the literary side from those covers. And for Sonia, the fragility and the destruction of the book in relation to the destruction of civilization. I mean, you raise huge questions in regards to what Lydia has just told us about these connections between societies and between continents. It is so significant, and it goes far beyond our comprehension, just looking at the objects themselves. So the book as the object, which has been your subject, Sonia, is, I think, so primarily important, especially to those in the Euro-Western side of the world, including myself, who are just starting to begin to understand what it means to have suffering in Iraq. But that's a bigger question.
Again, thanks, for attending this great panel. Thanks to all the speakers and to the audience. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.